Hey, it's a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Max. I work at Sablier, where we build a token streaming protocol, and I'm also on the side a student at the University of Montreal in both math and physics.
So you're working at Sablier and at the same time you're doing a degree for mathematics and physics, right?
Yeah. Let's just say that my degree is my hobby, and yeah, my work at Sablier primarily focuses on operations. I would say, so it's mostly everything that has nothing to do with the technical side, because my strategy has always been to, in my studies, to go on the technical side, while on the work side to go in everything that hasn't anything to do with the technical side, so that once I finish my studies, I will be as multidisciplinary as possible and just be able to address all the sides of the business, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting approach. You get the business skills and experience, and you still are able
Exactly.
to,
Yeah,
you know, do the technical aspects of it. And it sounds like you
exactly.
have a lot on your plate. And how do you manage your time? How do you make it work between your work and your hobby university?
So it's not a hobby, to be honest. I was joking there. Um, I would say one of the advantages with Sablier is that it's fully remote. So I can work wherever I want, whenever I want. So it's also asynchronous, which is a big advantage. We have a culture at Sablier where we are pretty much against calls in general. So we minimize as much as possible calls, and we really focus on asynchronous text-based conversations because they work much better in our experience for remote work. And so in that regard, it's much easier to mix with studies, because I can work whenever I have free time in my studies. I can directly focus on Sablier, get some tasks done. Usually also take some advances for the future weeks, and then yeah, I can manage it that way. So yeah, I don't think it would be possible if it were a physical, go to the actual office type of job. I don't think that would work.
Yeah, I agree that having a remote work possibility opens so many doors and allows you to be so much more productive. Just
Correct.
skipping the commute in itself is already such a big step up. There's another thousand other optimizations that you can implement during your day to make you do 10 times more than you should be able to do going to an actual office.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
can you can you tell us a little bit more about Sablier and what you actually do for the company?
Yeah, so at Sablier, we build a token streaming protocol. Right now, it's the leading streaming protocol in crypto. And so, what token streaming is basically is, if I want to send you $100 over a month, I can do so using Sablier, and every second of the month, you will receive a fraction of those $100. So effectively, it's like streaming a song on song on Spotify or a movie on Netflix, except here it's with money. And so we are really shifting the way payments work by synchronizing them with time, essentially, where every second you receive a fraction of the total payments. And so at Sablier, I focus mostly on everything that has to do with marketing, sales, customer support, organizing events, creating content, some strategy too, also some coding tasks, but mostly it's really non-technical. I would say.
Right, right. Yeah. I think Sablier is one of the few protocols that has direct use case in crypto. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
we are very proud of the fact. So sorry to interrupt. We are very proud to of the fact that we actually have real product market fit. Like our TVL is like, I think, between 100 and $200 million right now, and it's not incentivized. So we have never given yield rewards or any type of airdrop or farming or whatever. So it's, yeah, it's an actual real use case, which is actually really being used right now in crypto, which is
yeah,
pretty
no,
great.
I think it's wonderful. I think we definitely need more Sabliers out there doing things that are
Yeah,
actually important that and useful for people and companies.
correct.
And how did you end up getting this role?
Yeah, so I worked previously at Hi-Fi. So I was hired when I was 17 um, at Hi-Fi, which is a company building a fixed rate lending protocol. And at the time, I initially worked there on the community aspect, and from there evolved mostly on working in marketing and that kind of stuff. And Hi-Fi had initially acquired Sablier back in the day, and so I worked with Paul, who is now the CEO at Sablier, um, on a regular basis at Hi-Fi, and then eventually Sablier got so successful without any marketing. We reached, I think, over $1 billion in TVL back in 2021. I mean, it just got so successful, and again, without any marketing. We did nothing. We just laid it there because the whole team was focused on the hi-fi lending protocol which we were building at the time. And so it just got so successful that Paul started to think, oh, maybe we should spin out, which is kind of ironic given it was acquired a few years earlier. And so because when it was acquired, Sablier wasn't successful. So I think it had something like $100,000, $200,000 in TVL. And so it's really, once it got acquired, that's unfortunately it got really successful. Um, and so yeah, we decided to spin out. I joined Sablier with the move, and that's where I got.
Nice, nice. So you got your first job in this industry really, really young at 17. What is your advice for people that are still in high school or just starting uni and are looking to get into space? What's your advice for them to get a role in this industry?
Um, I mean, the fascinating thing with crypto is that you don't need any degrees or anything. I mean, people usually say that for startups, but when you apply for traditional startup, they say that, but it still matters. Like they will still give you bonus points if you do have a degree. In crypto, they really don't care. Like you could be hired by a DAO, like as an anonymous person, and they wouldn't even know that you are 17, 14, whatever. So I think this anonymity, or at least pseudonymity helps, people who are very young, who are, in generally speaking, uh, inexperienced, but who may be very talented and who should have their rightful place in the industry. And so in that regard, I think crypto is the best place to get started. And if I were to do it again, I would just join a ton of discords, become active. There are a ton of opportunities to work for decentralized organizations and these types of fields. You know, bounties. There are just tons of opportunities.
Right, so join all the discords that you might be interested in working for the company,
Exactly.
see if they have any work available, any bounties, try and engage with the community, trying to see how
Exactly.
where you can bring value, those sort of things, and you might not get noticed, and they actually don't care, who you are, how old are you, if you're doing good work,
Yeah.
you're likely to get hired.
Correct. Yeah. I think in general, if you're trustworthy in the space, that's all that matters. Because trust is very hard, ironically, in crypto, where we are building trustless systems. And so, if you have integrity, if you have, if you're a professional, I think you can really get a long way in crypto.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. I think having discipline and showing good work can take you a long way in this industry
Exactly.
because it's one of the best industries for, let's say, an almost pure meritocracy.
Yeah, it's a free market, right? Adam Smith would be proud. It's like the perfect implementations of free markets where there's no regulation, there are no rules. It's just Darwinian financial evolution, and you just build on top of the failures of others. And I think that's actually one of the beautiful things about crypto, and also one of the reasons why I don't think we need regulation for crypto, because the industry reinforces itself over time through its failures. I mean, the scandal with FTX got a lot of led to the creation of a lot of companies to audit companies, financially speaking, to track metrics, to do all these things to prevent new FTXs of happening. And so, if you introduce regulation, you limit that ability for the ecosystem itself to naturally strengthen. And so by doing so, you actually weaken the industry because you don't allow it to strengthen itself over time. And so it's kind of like counterintuitive, but you are better off in the long run by having no regulation than by having regulation, which helps in the short run but hurts you in the long run, I would say.
So your argument basically boils down to the systems that are going to arise from this are going to prevent crime altogether.
I mean, not altogether, obviously, but in a large part. I think
part.
you will see demands for these types of systems, and just like in any capitalistic system, when there's demands, offer comes, and people meet that demand. And so after FTX, there was a lot of demand for these types of solutions. They arrived, and they are still arriving, and so in that regard, I think it just makes a ton of sense to avoid regulation altogether because you have much more innovation. You aren't limited by all that bureaucracy, and yet you're still safe in the long run. In the short run, obviously, you have to go through a lot of pain. That's a cost you have to pay, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a anonymous race, right? Because with innovation, there comes more and more opportunity for new types of scams to emerge.
Exactly.
Right?
That's the problem.
And if you don't have any regulation, then you might end up just getting more and more scams because the innovation keeps getting forward, and that
Correct.
never pans out. So I
Correct.
think, being fully regulated, the way some people argue
Yeah.
for, is definitely probably on the worst side of ideas. Obviously you want to
Correct.
leave room for innovation and for better things, but on the other hand, I'm not sure if having no regulation would actually end up being that net positive, just because of the nature of the disruptive innovation of crypto. I think that it could actually end up never catching up. If the systems could end up not being mature enough to ever catch up to the latest scam or whatever. But
Yeah, I mean it's a mouse race, right? So it's always the scammer puts the next step, and then you have to always match and always match and always match. But I guess you could say the same thing about regulation, which is that once it's introduced, the scammers can just do the next thing and innovate essentially in terms of their scams, and then just counter the regulation. While with actual innovation through capitalism, people actually have an incentive to always match the latest scams, which regulation can't do because of all the bureaucracy, all the incentives, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's actually an argument for it. But yeah, I'm not married to the idea. But I think in generally speaking, less regulation is better than more regulation. Generally speaking.
yeah, no, I'm definitely trying to play devil's advocate here. I think the incentives for protocols and projects is way stronger to build systems that are actually going to be robust than for
Correct.
regulatory organs to figure out a way to keep up with the innovation, for sure.
Yeah.
But there's always room to be wrong on both sides
Of course.
and be cautious in a way. So who knows what would be actually the best path in the long run? Maybe a little sprinkle of regulation could be good in common sense. Some other unpopular opinions you have are around DAOs being a terrible idea. Do you want to share this a little bit?
It's so DAOs are actually a very slow way of doing things. And I think in general speaking, people in crypto tend to think, we built this protocol, we can now decentralize it, we're done. We reached, I don't know, let's imagine, we reached $1 billion in TVL, fine, we can decentralize it, give it to the community, and we're good to go. No, I don't think that's the right way of doing things. We are still so early. Your $1 billion in TVL is nothing compared to the trillions and trillions and trillions that there are in financial markets. And your little protocol, which you just decentralized, isn't going to match the scalability requirements and the risk requirements imposed by traditional finance. That's just not going to happen. So decentralizing now doesn't make sense in my opinion in that regard. And then second point is the fact that when you look at the way DAOs operate, they are, like, we call them decentralized autonomous organizations, but they aren't decentralized and they aren't autonomous. Calling something decentralized, I would say Ethereum is in a lot of ways decentralized. With staking, there are probably a lot of newly introduced centralized attack vectors. But Ethereum is relatively decentralized. But then when you look at the average DAO protocol on Ethereum in DeFi or whatever, it's not decentralized. It's a plutocracy controlled by VCs and insiders. And we have to be honest here. That's not necessarily a problem, but at least admit it. It's not decentralized. It's fine if you want to let your VCs and insiders run the protocol, but that's not decentralization. Decentralized is if you had actually all your users or whatever taking part in the protocol, and not just a few whales, which is basically just a plutocracy. So I think there's this theater show in crypto where we pretend, let's decentralize this, let's run a DAO. Well, in reality, you basically just made the system worse off with this a bit more decentralized than it was when it was initially in the startup that built it. But it's now much, much slower to innovate, a bit more decentralized, but still very, very centralized, and there isn't much coming out of it. And you also introduce a ton of attack vectors. A lot of DAOs have been attacked by people manipulating the token price and then buying a ton of it and then selling it and then these types of things. So I'm not convinced it's the right strategy yet. Maybe in the future, but I don't think we are there yet. And I think in general, when you look at Ethereum, for example, I think their approach to governance is very elegant. It's off-chain social governance. It's the developers, the people who actually know what needs to be done and what is actually happening, that discuss together. They need to get the actual approval from previously it was the miners, now it's the stakers, and so and from the users and everything. If there's a disagreement, they can always figure it out or fork, even though forking is now more difficult. But they can always process it. So I don't think there's an actual need in most cases for a DAO type of thing. I think off-chain social governance is much more elegant, especially because token holders have no clue about what needs to be done for a protocol. You don't let your company, like a traditional company wouldn't let its investors run the company. No, it's the investors who appoint someone to run the company, and that someone runs the company in a centralized way. There is a reason why that model has worked for 300 years. It's because it actually has proven to survive. And I don't think investors running the business works. Their incentives just aren't matched for the long run.
Yeah, I think there's a nice parallel between DAOs as they are right now and, let's say, the idea of communism, early in the days, where it's a nice utopia, and I could see myself,
Correct.
Let's say before we had the social experiments, we had the countries that signed up for this.
Correct.
I could see myself thinking that sounds nice, that could work.
Yeah.
Obviously we all know that it doesn't work at all. It's a very bad idea. And I think in my mind, that's the parallel to DAOs right now. It sounds
Correct.
like a good idea, but the implementation of it and the execution has a lot of flaws. But on the other hand, one could say that it is the most democratic version of a company that you could arguably get to an extent. It can help avoid tyranny and exploitation if things are distributed equally.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure I agree with that, because you could do it like Rye, this stablecoin, did it, which is so what Rye, Reflex or Rye did, is that they launched their protocol, and then they said we're progressively just going to remove governance. And so they had this ungovernance meme where they ungovernance the protocol. and so they basically barely have any governance left. I don't think governance has any power anymore, even on the protocol. And as a user, if you disagree, or as a developer, if you disagree, well, you can just fork Rye and build your own version. It's very democratic. You can just vote with your feet and just leave the protocol and the community. So it's actually as democratic as it gets. You just don't need the governance, the on-chain token governance. You can still have off-chain social governance and build on the top of the protocol, or work with others to build a new version of the protocol. But you don't need the actual token gated governance, I think.
Yeah, and speaking of tokens, you also mentioned that less than 1% of the tokens nowadays have any real reason to exist. And
Yeah.
everything else is just trash, essentially. So what
It's
gives a token a real reason to exist? What are the properties that we're looking for?
I wouldn't say it's trash, but it's cash grabs. You're doing it to raise money, and there's no actual use case behind it, and that's okay if you want to make money. But I think a lot of people in crypto, again, it's like this theater show where they pretend that they are investing in something with real tangible value. Like Ben Graham, like would be very proud of like actual stocks. But no, it's just worthless governance tokens. It's not better than your latest Pokemon card, because no actual speculator actually cares about the governance part. Like they all say they do. They all say, oh no, governance is a use case, and yet they never vote. So it's this hypocrisy, and so governance is not an actual use case. So for governance is a bad idea, and it's not an actual use case. An actual use case is like Ethereum. When you have Ether is an actual currency. It's used for staking. It's used to pay on the network as a currency. It has a ton of different use cases. I think Synthetics has also an elegant approach where you have to stake the tokens in order to mint new synthetic assets. And so it's essentially this like type of like debt system based on their token, which I think is also fairly elegant. And then you have systems like the Graph, for example, where you have to stake tokens to curate certain subgraphs. You pay in the Graph tokens. I think if you want to run a subgraph or something, or an indexer, you also have to stake tokens. So it's this very utility-based system where it actually makes sense. But for most protocols, you could just use Ether or whatever stable coin, which actually makes sense. I think one of the arguments used for the Aave, for example, for the existence of the Aave token was that there is an Aave pool where users can actually stake their token, and if Aave is ever hacked, they can get their funds back through that pool. So it's sort of like a buffer or insurance pool. But you could do the same thing with Ether or USDC if you were decentralized, or DAI if you want to pretend you are decentralized, but you are actually centralized. So it's you don't need your actual token. In most cases, you really don't.
Right. And I think sometimes protocols, they can present very complex mechanisms to the point
Yeah,
that it gets hard to discern what is a valid use case and what is not a valid use case. Like
correct.
when is this token actually necessary and when this token is not actually necessary. Would you have any tips for someone trying to make their own mind up, looking at a protocol that they just found? If you were looking at X protocol, what would be like maybe some red flags that this token it's not actually doing anything or is not necessary in the mechanism? And I know this is a very it might be a hard question to answer because there are so many variants, but
Of
um,
course.
maybe you can give us a little bit of a mindset.
Yeah. I think in general, well, all you need to do is basically just ask your question: what if they were using Ether or just like another traditional token? Would it work? And if it doesn't, then you actually have a reason to use a token. If it does, then there's no reason. And it's like for rollups, for example. Optimism, Arbitrum, they all introduced their token. I'm pretty sure they could all run using Ether. I don't think they need their token, and I think especially for Optimism and Arbitrum, on-chain governance for these types of networks is, in my opinion, a terrible idea, because it just completely breaks this idea of credible neutrality, where you want to show developers that they can just build in the long run, while knowing that the governance won't turn their back against them. And so, yeah, just ask the question: could it run with another token?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to generalize it and approach something that you have no idea. I think it's a simple way to approach it. And now I think we can switch gears a little bit. You're interested in very different subjects. So I wanted to ask you about quantum computing and how much would that change our world and what sort of things would be made possible?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of hype in the media about quantum computing. I think it's like AI back in the day, and still today actually, where people think, oh, AI, etc. Well, they actually usually conflate AGI with AI, which is really very different. But when it comes to quantum computing, there's this idea that it will just revolutionize everything, it will change the world, and yeah, I think in a lot of ways it will change the world, but not in the way people think it will. Essentially, you just get, for specific tasks, you get orders of magnitude more computing power, which can be just incredibly useful for a ton of different use cases. But for others, it's not actually better than a traditional computer. Now, the advantage of a quantum computer is that it should be able to simulate a traditional computer. So you can run a traditional computer in a quantum computer. So it's probable that in the very long-term future, once we have an actually viable quantum computer, we will be able to just use it all the time, and we will just completely forget about traditional computers. And so, yeah, the interest in my case comes from the fact that it's a very, very young field. We are still very, very early. The current existing quantum computers are rarely actual quantum computers and actually performing well when it comes to computation. They're usually very, very limited in terms of computing power because we still haven't figured out how to scale them well over, thousands and then eventually, hopefully, millions of qubits. And so we're still there early. There's a lot of hype, a lot of scams probably too. But in the long run, I think it's a very promising technology.
Right, and what would be one of the areas that quantum computers would make a difference? So, from what you said, it would probably be something that takes advantage of a quicker time. So, making huge calculations. And where do you see that could be a huge shifting factor?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, encryption, for example, or certain things in mathematics would, be an obvious use case for it. I think there are probably things in many other fields, like healthcare, probably, where a lot more where that computation could be harnessed in a very efficient way. But generally speaking, it's like any other any new technology. You don't really know yet the use cases.
Right.
AI. Who could have predicted that ChatGPT would become so successful? VR, for example. The initial bet was that, we will all have this headset, and now we have Apple coming with the Apple Vision Pro, which is actually a very different implementation from what it originally felt and looked like. So it's very hard to predict the use cases early on, but I think it will transform a lot of fields, a lot of them.
And some say that quantum computing is a threat to crypto. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean it's like it's an early field. There's a lot of speculation. Um, Most investors probably don't really know uh, what it is and how it works. They just heard the term quantum computing, they read it in the media, they are bullish on it, but they don't really get it, which is just like crypto. Um, you are at the forefront of innovation, at the frontier of innovation, which means, yeah, just a lot of scams, a lot of innovation too, but a lot of scams, a lot of hype. I think there are a lot of similarities, just like AI back in the day, probably VR, AR too. These new technologies attract a lot of the same demographics uh, because of their nature, I guess.
Right. And another topic that you and apparently the whole team at Sablier is really into is longevity. So,
Yeah.
what habits and activities do you practice, and how much do you believe they're going to extend your lifespan?
So, so my concern in that regard is that our generation will be able to live probably much longer, if not indefinitely, thanks to the advances with regards to medication and these types of things. Um, just because there's this like sort of escape velocity, where let's say uh, you did all these things to extend your life by 20 years. So now you live to 100 years, for example. But during those 20 years, that gives time to the medical industry to invent new ways to extend your life. And then during those 20 years, you can extend them by, let's say, 30 years. And then in the next 30 years, they can extend your life by 50 years. And so there's this escape velocity where you just get out of the traditional limits of aging, and eventually you can live indefinitely, unless you get run over by a car, which will be probably be one of the leading causes of death over like some type of similar accident. Um, and I think disease in general will just be forgotten. Um, but generally speaking, what I'm doing right now is actually very basic. I just take care of my sleep. I work out and I try to eat healthy. I think if you do these basics, you probably get 80% of the benefits. It's like the party principle. Um, so you can just go much further. I know Paul, my boss at Sablier, is very much into longevity and just a lot of things. Um, you know, just like taking a ton of supplements, focusing a lot with like blue light, and just doing all these different things. And I guess you can optimize it that way, but the benefits will probably be comparatively smaller. And I think you can get the most benefits just by focusing on these three things.
Right, right. Yeah, I agree. I think sleep and exercise are the number two things, and nutrition, obviously, that can change your not only your longevity but your quality of life. Just have one
Exactly.
good night's sleep, like, whoa, I feel good. If you
Yeah,
feel good many nights in a row, no wonder you're gonna
exactly.
live longer. Um, and in your website, you have a bunch of interesting resources. I'll leave the link in the description for anyone want to check it out. It
Thank you.
has anything ranging from physics to personal development. And there are two resources that I found that were particularly interesting to me, and I was wondering if you can explain them a little bit. Um, on the book by David Deutsch, The Beginning of Infinity, and also on the Anthropic Principle from Brett Hall.
Yeah, so The Beginning of Infinity is a book from David Deutsch that I read, I think a year or two ago, and which really shaped my worldview. So I basically view everything now through his lens, um, and I think it's just an incredible book. I've read probably just like tens and tens and tens of books in the past few years, and this is not like to brag or anything. It's just to show that this book is like better than all these books combined. Like if I were to just read one book, I would just read this one over and over again and just would forget about everything else. It's just miles above all the others. Um, and so in terms of concepts, it's a very multidisciplinary book because it covers just like a ton of different subjects. But the general idea of the beginning of infinity is that we are at the beginning of infinity, and that we will always be at the beginning of infinity, and that we can always infinitely, essentially, innovate, grow, and expand our quality of life. And I think it's this very optimistic worldview, and it's a very optimistic way of viewing things about the world. And this is something which has really changed the way I see the world, because we have this very traditionally very pessimistic outlook on life, at least here in Europe, where I come from, where it's always about, growth is very bad, capitalism is very bad, and these types of things. Whereas, well, we have never lived as well as we live today. Our quality of life has never been better. And when you look back, I think it was back in just right before the Industrial Revolution happened, nearly 50% of children died before reaching the age of 15. So when you look at how in 300 years we were able to massively improve our quality of life to the point that now you don't even worry as a parent. I think I'm not a parent yet, but you don't even worry that your child will die before they reach the age of 15. It's just not a question you ask yourself anymore. So I think our quality of life has just increased so massively that these critiques of growth and capitalism are very, first in a sense, hypocritical, but second, also just completely wrong. It's just great.
Yeah, I think it's a interesting perspective, because most contrarians would say, well, things can't keep growing forever. Like they say capitalism is like always growing, and things can keep growing forever. But I think what I thought really interesting when I started looking at that book is that it's not about the growth, but it's about like a longevity perspective, like the concept
Correct.
of infinity, and you're always at the beginning of something.
Yes.
So it's not like you're climbing this mountain that has no end. I mean, growth is not.
Yeah.
It's not about the growth of this mountain. It's more about this journey that keeps going.
Yeah, and you can infinitely optimize something. There's no actual, like, even in terms of physics, you will always be able to optimize it to the latest, like, micrometer
Yeah,
that
you can keep
follows the laws of physics.
splitting the numbers up.
Exactly.
Exactly. Like
So
0.001, 0.0000001
to infinity. Exactly.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
there's basically no end, and we can keep living better basically just by inventing new technologies, and improving our quality of life.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about the Anthropic Principle?
Yes, yeah. So the Anthropic Principle is basically that the universe is. I mean, it's kind of like a tautology in the sense that it's, our universe is actually weirdly made in a way that allows the existence of observers, which is us basically, um, which is obvious because if it weren't, we wouldn't be there. So there's this kind of like tautological aspect I would say to it, whereas it's always true. And so yeah, it's this idea of is there, like, the universe is weirdly fine tuned, just like species were like back in the day when you had Darwin, and then people thought, it's weird that these species are so specialized, like so well made to conform with their habitat and ecosystem. That can't be natural. It's God doing it. And so I think eventually we will find an explanation for why that is the case. Why all our all the constants in physics, gravity, whatever, are made in a way that allows life, and how that happens. But yeah, right now we don't know, and so people appeal to the supernatural, whereas I think there's obviously a rational explanation.
Yeah, so basically I think a good way to maybe summarize this is that it's about there being an underlying metric that makes life almost unavoidable in the
Correct.
universe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think that's a good sentiment. I don't think that life is just a lucky sparkle. I think there's too many coincidences for it to be able to happen. But who knows?
Who
And
knows?
I have one last question for you. If you found a genie that knew everything, you could ask him one question, what would you ask him?
That's a very good question. I would say I would probably ask. I mean, that's like an infinite regress, but I would probably ask what the or actually no, I would probably ask what the perfect model of governance is for humans. Because if you can have the perfect model of governance for humans, then you can organize humans in the perfect way, and then you can figure out the solutions for all the problems in our universe. And so there's no point in asking other questions. So
And
yeah,
then we can fix DAOs.
exactly. So because you know I think democracy is great. It's probably the least bad way we know right now of governing people without violence. Obviously, you can go into the type of like technocratic models of Singapore, for example, um, but these are like more authoritarian. And then if the leader at one point in time makes terrible decisions and becomes a tyrant, um, there is actually no way of removing these people from power. I mean, I don't know the specifics of Singapore, but generally speaking, in a dictatorship, and I'm not saying that Singapore is a dictatorship, by the way. It's just an example, wrongfully. But if you just take like the general dictatorship, it's very hard to remove that person from power without violence. You basically always just have to have a revolution or a coup, and so democracy in that regard is the best way of doing things because you can remove people who aren't fit for power in the most efficient way without violence. But there's probably a better way. There's probably a way to improve it. And so if we can figure that out, because I mean, I don't mean to say that our democracies are particularly very efficient right now. I think it's fair to say that we could make things much better. We could align the incentives of our politicians much better with the actual interests of the country. And so in that regard, if you could find a system which aligns all these incentives together, while still having this idea of if the person isn't fit for the power, we can just remove them without violence. If you are able to do so, you basically just figured out how to like all the solutions to whatever you can think of, because humanity will be able to organize itself in such a way that you will be able to figure out any problem you encounter.
Yeah, I think democracy definitely sucks, but is the best thing you have right now.
Exactly.
From all the systems, it's the one that's working the least worse. And it's
Exactly.
a really hard problem, governance, because you have to find, it's almost a fine-tuning exercise of structures and incentives.
Exactly.
And there's so many ways that it can be done, but every iteration has to be played over such a long time span that it's
Correct.
hard to try this one out and then see if that works.
Correct.
Which is one of the reasons why I think DAOs are really interesting, because I think
Yeah.
it's a speed run of those types of systems.
Exactly.
And I think that's gonna push forward our governance system a lot when we actually figure it out, because testing in these microcosms in this faster speeds is a good way to iterate, and there's not that much at stake.
Correct.
And I think eventually we're gonna find mechanisms that work way better. I think for me, one of the biggest issues is that it's hard to put someone in power that doesn't want to be in power, and those are usually one of the best leaders.
Yeah.
And it's just a tricky problem. How do you incentivize those people? And then once you
Yeah.
incentivize them, they might change their mind. So yeah, it's definitely something hard. And if I find a genie, I think I might steal your question as well.
Yeah, and I think it kind of boils down to one of the major influences on David Deutsch was Karl Popper, who was this big philosopher in the 20th century, and one of the ideas of Popper is that there's a big problem when it comes to communism and these types of things, is that it's a form of utopian social engineering, basically. So what they try to do is basically what they did in Brazil with the Brasilia city, is that they try to build the whole thing at once, and just like this whole model where humans have to fit in. But the problem is that our human society, and especially when you have like billions of different humans just operating in a different way and interacting, you cannot predict how they are going to behave around that system. And so you can't, that idea of, okay, we are going to deliver this whole system all at once, like they did in Brasilia or with communism, where they just create this whole system and then you have to fit into it. It doesn't work because you can never predict how humans are going to behave around that system. And so what you need is to finish, what you need is sort of like piecemeal improvements, where you do something, you try it out, you see if it works, and then you improve. But as you said, the problem is that in democracy in our society, you need to try it on like 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and even then, you may still not have actually found the right truth. Maybe it will break after 250 years, and so it's very hard. And in that regard, crypto is perfect. It's the perfect testing space both for financial innovation and for this governance innovation, because it's just wild anarchy markets where you can just do whatever you want, experiment, see if it works, and then just speedrun it because of the incentives it brings to speculators.
Do you think that quantum computing could ever simulate that kind of thing, that those kind of experience simulate human behavior?
Maybe. I don't think there's actually a law of physics limiting that. But I think it's probably very, 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 very far off. I mean, we barely even know how the brain works, which is actually surprising given you have all of these people focusing on AGI. Well, in fact, they're working on AI, which is very different, but they're all focusing on AGI. So AGI is this idea of let's basically create sort of like human, but on a computer, like sort of like artificial form of consciousness. But we don't even know how consciousness works. so yeah. I just don't get how we will get there without even understanding what it actually is in the first place. And so I think, yes, it's just a very, very, very long time before we get there.
Yeah, I think we as humans, we are very ambitious and sometimes arrogant in the amount of things that we know. I think as we stand right now, we have figured out many things about the world around us and the universe, but at the same time, it feels like we don't know anything.
We are at the
And I think
beginning
that
of
goes
infinity.
back to the beginning of infinity, right? We don't even know how our own heads work, and
Correct.
we here trying to build a super entity and live on Mars.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Which is great,
so
by
I
the
don't
way.
know if that's
Ambition is
inspiring
great.
or dumb.
Yeah, I think ambition is great, and I don't think we should stop with that. But I think we should realize when we are going the wrong way, which I think we are with AI and AGI, which is that AI is this very narrow, very specific algorithm, whereas AGI is this thing which can learn anything, whatever you give it, it can learn it just like a human, and it's fit to do everything that can be approached in life, even new things which the original creator hasn't thought about. Well, that's not the case with AI. If you give it a completely new thing to an AI, to a current AI like ChatGPT, it will have no clue. And so these things are very different. And when people say, "Oh, well, there are sparks of AGI in ChatGPT or whatever," I think you would honestly feel it if there were actual sparks of AGI. I think you would actually feel it, that you are actually talking to something which is conscious. You would be able to differentiate it from an actual algorithm which is just running on your computer. But that's not the case. It's still just an algorithm which is predicting the next word when it answers you.
Yeah, I think the feeling is subjective, but I think there's maybe a quantitative difference of output that we could discuss.
Correct.
I think that would be a stark contrast between what we have now and what AGI would actually be like.
Correct. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah. Well, Max, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Yeah, thank you for coming over and having this chat.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.